The rattle of the rails had been a constant companion for 3 days, a rhythm that had worked its way into Ella Marin West's bones. It was a language of its own, speaking of distance covered and a life left behind. Outside the grimy window, the fertile, forgiving green of Kansas had long since given way to something starker, more honest. The plains of Wyoming stretched out under a sky so vast and blue it seemed to press down on the earth, bleaching the grass to a pale gold and carving shadows deep and sharp from the low, rolling hills. The air that seeped through the carriage's ill-fitting frame was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush and a profound, aching emptiness that felt like both a threat and a promise. In her lap, her hands, large and capable, rested on a small reticule. They were not the hands of a delicate lady. The knuckles were pronounced, the palms calloused from hauling water, kneading dough, and tending a garden that always seemed to demand more than it gave. Inside the reticule, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, were the letters, 4 of them, written over 6 months in a strong, clear hand on sturdy paper. They were the reason for this journey, the foundation of a hope she had dared to build. Their author was a man named Carter Lynell, the blacksmith in a town called Dusthorn. He had written to her minister back in Kansas, seeking a respectable woman for a wife. Ella, at 26, was considered well past her prime, a fixture in her family home who was becoming more of a burden than a blessing. And then there was her height, at a shade over 6 feet. She towered over every man in her county. They looked at her as a curiosity, a fine, strong creature fit for farm work, but not for the intimate dance of marriage. They looked at her as if she were a draft horse they were being asked to waltz with. But Carter Lynell's letters had been different. He couldn't see her height. He saw only the words her minister had used to describe her pious, hard-working, and of a sturdy, healthy constitution. In his letters, Carter wrote not of romance, but of partnership. Asterisk, I am a man of simple means. Miss West. Asterisk, he had written in his first letter. Asterisk, but my hands are honest and my forge is my own. This town is a hard place, but it is a growing one. A man needs a helpmeet, a woman to build a life with, to share the silence of the evenings and the burden of the days. I can offer you a good roof, a full table, and the respect due to the wife of a respected tradesman. Asterisk. He wrote of the sound of his hammer on the anvil, a ringing that was the heartbeat of the town. He wrote of the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, of the way the sun set behind the Laramie Peak, turning the sky to bruised purple and fiery orange. He wrote of his loneliness, not in a pitiable way, but as a simple fact, like the weather. His words were like him. She imagined solid, practical, and true. They had felt like a cool hand on a fevered brow. For the first time, Ella had felt seen not as an awkward giantess, but as a woman of sturdy constitution. He had made her strength sound like a virtue, not a failing. And so, she had accepted. She sold the few things she owned, packed her mother's quilt and 2 sturdy dresses into a heavy valise, and bought a one-way ticket to Dusthorn, Wyoming. Hope was a fragile, unfamiliar bird in her chest, and she guarded it fiercely against the jolts of the train and the vast, intimidating landscape. The train's whistle shrieked, a long, mournful cry that sliced through the afternoon air. It was a sound of arrival. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels slowed, replaced by the grinding squeal of brakes and the great, weary sigh of steam. Ella stood, her head brushing the curved ceiling of the carriage, and pulled her valise from the rack. She felt the familiar sensation of all eyes in the carriage turning to her, the subtle shifts and murmurs as she moved down the aisle. She was used to the height that made her a landmark in any room, a subject of immediate and often unflattering speculation. She carried her stature not with pride, but with a quiet, weary resignation. Stepping down from the train was like stepping into an oven. The sun was a physical weight, beating down on the dusty platform. Dusthorn was not so much a town as a raw collection of buildings huddled together against the immensity of the plains. A single main street, wide and rutted, was flanked by a dozen or so unpainted wooden structures, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that gaped like a mouth, a land office, and, at the far end, a larger building from which a rhythmic asterisk clang, clang, clang asterisk echoed the smithy, her new home. A small crowd had gathered to meet the train, a mix of ranchers in dusty Stetsons, a few women in faded calico dresses, and a handful of curious children. They were all faces weathered by sun and wind, their eyes narrowed, watchful. Ella scanned them, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was looking for a man she had never seen, whose face she had tried to conjure from the character of his handwriting. Then she saw him. He was standing slightly apart from the others, as if he knew his business was a private one, yet was forced to conduct it in public. He was not as tall as she had imagined, but he was broad, powerfully built. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle, and a leather apron was tied around his waist. He had dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard, and he held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. He looked anxious, hopeful. He looked like his letters. He saw her at the same moment. He was scanning the few passengers disembarking, his brow furrowed in concentration. His eyes passed over her once, dismissed her as part of the landscape, then snapped back, widening in disbelief. His smile, a fragile thing to begin with, faltered and died. His gaze didn't meet hers. It climbed her, an unwilling ascent from the hem of her travel-worn dress, over her sturdy waist, past her broad shoulders, and finally, reluctantly, to her face. And then it dropped to the dusty ground between them as if the altitude was too much to bear. A silence fell over the platform, a different kind of silence from the one in his letters. It was the charged, hungry quiet of a town starved for spectacle. The rhythmic clang from the smithy ceased, leaving a ringing void. Every eye was on them. Ella's hope, the fragile bird in her chest, fluttered once, then grew still and heavy as a stone. She knew, in that single, sweeping glance, she knew. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He stopped a few feet away, still refusing to look her in the eye. The valise in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Miss West?" he asked, his voice rough, uncertain. "Mr. Lionel," she replied. Her own voice was steady. A small miracle. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He gestured vaguely toward her, a motion that encompassed all of her considerable frame. "There has been a misunderstanding." The whispers started at the edge of the crowd, a low hiss like dried leaves skittering across a hard pan. Ella stood perfectly still, her spine straight as a surveyor's rod. She kept her gaze fixed on the top of his head. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice betraying none of the cold dread that was seeping into her limbs. "The letters?" he stammered, his face flushing a dark, mottled red. He finally risked a glance at her face, then looked away again, toward the general store, as if pleading for help. "Your minister, he described you as a woman of sturdy constitution." "I am," Ella said simply. "I am healthy and I am a hard worker." "Yes, well," Carter Lionel cleared his throat, the sound loud in the unnatural quiet. "That is one word for it. This is not what I envisioned. Not at all." He was not a cruel man by nature, perhaps, but he was a proud one, and a weak one. He was the town blacksmith. His wife was meant to be a reflection of his status, a neat, compact woman who would fit neatly by his side in church, who would look up at him, not down. He had imagined a partner, yes, but a subordinate one. He had not imagined a woman who would make him feel small just by standing next to him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Miss West," he said, his voice gaining a cold, formal edge. "I am sorry for your journey. It was a mistake. A man in my position, He expects a wife of a certain proportion, someone a man can look after, someone more refined. The word hung in the air between them, refined, . It was a stone thrown directly at her calloused hands, her strong shoulders, her sheer, unapologetic size. It was meant to shame her. And it did. A hot wave of humiliation washed over her, so intense it made her vision swim. He did not wait for a reply. There was nothing more to be said. He put his hat back on his head, pulling the brim down low, and turned his back on her. He pushed his way through the crowd, which parted for him silently. He walked down the main street, back toward the sound of his livelihood, without a single backward glance. The spell was broken. The whispers erupted into low murmurs and a few poorly stifled snickers. People began to turn away, exchanging glances and shaking their heads. The show was over. They went back to their business, leaving her as the wreckage. Ella stood alone on the main street of Dusthorn, a tall, solitary figure silhouetted against the vast, uncaring Wyoming sky. The train, her last link to the world she knew, gave a final hiss and began to chug slowly away, its rhythmic clatter fading into the distance. She was left with the dust, the crushing weight of the sun, and the stares of strangers. The handle of her valise was a hard, unyielding line against her palm, the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved into whispers and shame. The sun, which had been a merciless white hammer in the sky, was beginning to bleed out across the horizon. Its light, no longer direct, slanted through the dusty air in long, accusatory shafts of copper and crimson. It was the kind of light that made a single figure cast a long, distorted shadow, and Ella's stretched out before her on the rutted street, a dark, elongated caricature of the woman she was. She felt pinned by it, an insect on a specimen board. For a long time, she did not move. To move would be to acknowledge that the world had not, in fact, ended. Her mind was a hollow, ringing space where Carter Lionel's final words still echoed refined, proportion . The shame was a physical thing, a hot, tight cloak wrapped around her shoulders, so heavy she thought her knees might buckle under its weight. The town of Dusthorn slowly came back to life around her. The initial, hungry silence had been replaced by the very sounds she was meant to make her own. The resumed, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer felt like a personal blow with every strike. The squeak of a wagon's axle, the distant whinny of a horse, the low murmur of voices from the porch of the general store. They were all part of a life that had been offered and then violently snatched away. The crowd didn't so much disperse as melt. A woman herded her children past, pulling them close and averting her eyes as if Ella's public disgrace were a contagion. Two ranchers tipped their hats in a gesture that was less about respect and more about dismissal, a way of closing a chapter as they ambled toward the saloon. They walked around her, giving her a wide berth as if she were a deep hole in the road. Each person that turned away, each averted gaze, was another small nail hammered into the coffin of the hope she had carried all the way from Kansas. She was no longer a prospective bride. She was an anecdote, a story that would be told over beers and mending for weeks to come. The tall woman from Kansas. She stared at her valise, its sturdy leather sides seeming to mock her. It held everything she owned, everything she was. It felt less like a piece of luggage and more like a tombstone marking the grave of a foolish dream. Where could she possibly go? Back to the station, the next eastbound train wasn't for 2 days. She had barely enough money for food, let alone a ticket home to a life of sympathetic looks and the suffocating knowledge that she had tried and failed. A hotel, if this town even had one, was an impossible luxury. The light deepened, the red turning to a bruised purple at the edges of the sky. The air grew cooler. She needed to move, to do something other than stand here, a monument to her own folly. But her feet felt rooted to the Wyoming soil, as if the ground itself were holding her captive at the scene of her humiliation. It was then that a new sound broke her trance, the soft scuff of boots on dry earth. She braced herself, expecting a jeer, a crude remark from one of the men leaving the saloon, or perhaps the sharp, pitying voice of a church-going woman offering charity that would feel like another slap. A man was walking toward her from the wide, shadowed maw of the livery stable next to the general store. He wasn't coming from the crowd. He had been there all along, a silent observer in the periphery. He was tall, nearly her own height, with shoulders that were broad, not with padding but with the dense, hard-packed muscle of a man who worked against resistance all day. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet sureness that was the opposite of Carter Lionel's flustered pride. As he stepped out of the shadows and into the last bloody light of the day, she saw that his dark hair was unruly, and his face was angular, carved by sun and wind into something that was neither handsome nor plain, but simply settled, permanent. He wiped his hands on his denim trousers, leaving faint streaks of dust and chaff behind. He stopped a respectable distance from her, not crowding her space, and he looked at her. It was the look that was so different. Every other person in Dusthorn had looked at her with shock, with amusement, with scorn, or with pity. Their gazes had measured her, dissected her, and found her wanting. This man's eyes, a clear, steady gray like a winter sky, simply met hers. There was no surprise in them, no judgment. He wasn't looking at her height. He was looking at her face. He saw not a spectacle, but a person. It was a look so devoid of artifice that it was more startling than any insult. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, with a rough texture to it, like worn leather. "Ma'am," he said, the word a simple acknowledgement of her presence. "Where are you figuring on staying tonight?" The question was so plain, so practical. It cut straight through the fog of her shame. It wasn't an offer of help. Not yet. It wasn't colored with the pity she dreaded. It was a simple inquiry into fact, spoken as if he were asking her the time of day. He was addressing her predicament, not her person. Ella's throat was tight and dry. She tried to form a word, but only a dry rasp came out. She swallowed, the action feeling huge and clumsy. I don't know," she finally managed to whisper. The admission felt like the last of her strength leaving her body. The man didn't press. He just stood there, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gray eyes watching her with that same unnerving calm. He seemed to be listening not just to her words, but to the silence that surrounded them. "Town doesn't have a proper hotel," he said, his gaze shifting for a moment to the saloon, where the sound of a tinny piano had just started up. "Just rooms for rent up there. It's no place for a woman traveling alone. Too much noise, too much trouble." He said it as a statement of fact, not as a judgment on her or the men inside. He was laying out the landscape for her, showing her the map of a town she knew nothing about. He looked back at her. "The station master will let you sleep on a bench in the ticket office, but it's cold, and the night freight comes through around 3, rattles the whole building." Again, just facts. He was giving her information, allowing her the dignity of understanding her own options, however bleak they might be. He was not telling her what to do or what she needed. He was talking to her as if she were a capable human being who had found herself in an impossible situation. The last of the sun dipped below the horizon, and the world was plunged into a soft, gray twilight. The shadows deepened, wrapping around them, creating a small pocket of privacy in the middle of the street. "I have no money for a room anyway," Ella said, the words coming out flat and toneless. It was the truth, and saying it aloud felt like stripping herself of the last of her pride. The man, Colt Brannan, though she didn't know his name yet, didn't flinch. Her poverty was just one more fact to be dealt with. He nodded slowly, as if she had just confirmed something he already knew. "There's a loft," he said, tipping his head back toward the livery. "Above the stalls, it's clean, and the hay is fresh. It's warm. It's quiet." He paused. "It's empty." Ella stared at him, trying to find the angle, the hidden price in his offer. Was this a different kind of proposition? But there was nothing in his face to suggest it. His expression was open, his gaze direct. He was offering shelter, pure and simple. She looked from his steady face to the dark opening of the livery stable. It smelled of things she understood: hay, horses, leather, honest sweat. It smelled of work. It smelled real. It was a world away from the false promises of a blacksmith's parlor. She had no choice. To say no would be to choose the cold bench and the public gaze of the station. To say yes was to place her trust in the first and only person who had looked at her without seeing a freak. She gave a single sharp nod. He didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Without another word, he stepped forward and reached for her valise. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he took the handle. He hefted the bag, his expression unchanging, as if its considerable weight was exactly what he expected. He was strong. It seemed to be no more to him than a sack of oats. He turned and started walking toward the stable. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just trusted that she would. And after a moment's hesitation, her feet finally coming unstuck from the dirt, Ella Marin West followed the stranger into the deep, quiet shadows of the barn. The threshold of the livery stable was a clear line between two worlds. Outside lay the public street, the scene of her evisceration, bathed in the dying, judgmental light of day. Inside was a deep, encompassing darkness, thick with the warm, living smells of hay, horses, and well-oiled leather. It was a place of work and animal comfort, an honest sanctuary from the complexities of men. A horse shifted in a nearby stall, its heavy body rustling the straw bedding, followed by a soft, curious nicker. The sound was a welcome of a kind. Animals did not judge a person's height or the circumstances of their arrival. They judged by the scent of a person, the steadiness of their hands. Colt Brannan set her valise down just inside the door and reached for a lantern hanging from a peg. He struck a match against the rough-hewn wall, and the flare of it momentarily illuminated the sharp planes of his face. Casting his eyes into deep shadow, he touched the flame to the wick, and a soft, golden light bloomed, pushing the darkness back into the corners and revealing the stable's interior. It was a large, well-kept space, with a wide aisle flanked by a dozen stalls. The air was hazy with dust motes dancing in the lantern light like tiny, captured stars. He didn't speak, merely picked up her bag and the lantern and nodded toward a sturdy ladder at the back of the barn that led up to the loft. Ella followed, the sound of her own weary footsteps echoing his firm tread on the hard-packed earth. The ladder was solid under her hands and feet. For once, her long limbs were an advantage, allowing her to ascend with an easy, steady rhythm. As she climbed, she rose above the world of the stable floor, the horses shrinking below her, their twitching ears and broad backs becoming a new kind of landscape. The loft was a vast, open space under the high-peaked roof. The air up here was even warmer, thick with the sweet, dry perfume of tons of fresh hay, piled in great soft mountains on either side of a clear central space. Through a large, open hatch at the far end, meant for hauling up hay bales, a perfect rectangle of the twilight sky was visible, a deep, velvety indigo pricked with the first stars of evening. The world felt distant from up here, its sounds muffled and softened. Colt set the lantern on a low, sturdy beam, its light creating a small island of warmth and visibility. He placed her valise beside it. "You can take this spot here," he said, gesturing to a particularly thick, clean pile of hay. "It's dry. The roof doesn't leak." Ella stood for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her. She was braced for the questions, the inevitable probing into the wound of her rejection. A man didn't offer a woman shelter without wanting the story that went with it. It was a form of currency. But Colt Brannan did not ask. He didn't look at her with curiosity. He turned away and walked over to an old wooden crate, from which he pulled 2 thick, gray horse blankets. They were clean, smelling faintly of wool and the clean scent of the stable. He shook one out, the motion efficient and practiced, and laid it over the spot he had indicated, smoothing it down with his large hands. He worked with a quiet focus, his silence a statement in itself. He had seen what had happened on the street. He'd seen the hope on her face curdle into shock, had watched the proud blacksmith shrink from her stature and turn tail. He knew why she was here, stranded and alone, and he seemed to understand that to speak of it, to force her to recount the humiliation, would be a cruelty far sharper than simply leaving her on the street. He knew the weight of a town's collective stare, though she had no way of knowing that. He understood the brand of shame that didn't wash off, and the silence that was often the only balm for it. To give her that silence was the only real comfort he had to offer. Ella watched him, the tight knot of apprehension in her stomach slowly beginning to loosen. She, in turn, did not ask him who he was, or why a man who worked in a livery stable was not home with a family of his own. She did not ask why he was helping her. To ask would be to break the unspoken pact between them. They were two strangers, sharing a space, each granting the other the dignity of their own private history. He laid the second blanket neatly beside the first. "Wyoming nights get cold," he said, his back still to her. "Even in summer, the wind comes down from the mountains with a bite to it." She finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Thank you." He gave a slight nod, accepting her gratitude but not dwelling on it. "I'll be down in the tack room. There's a cot. No one will bother you up here." He made to leave, to pick up the lantern and descend back into the darkness. But then he hesitated. He looked from her to the cold, empty space around them. He seemed to make a decision. "Wait here," he said, and then he was gone, climbing back down the ladder with a quiet agility that surprised her. Ella stood alone in the golden circle of light, a flicker of uncertainty returning, but it was different now. It wasn't the panic of abandonment, but a simple curiosity. She listened to his movements below the clink of metal, the soft scrape of a door opening and closing. The sounds were purposeful. A few minutes later, he reappeared up the ladder. In one hand, he carried a small, blackened coffee pot, and in the other, 2 tin mugs hooked over his fingers. A faint, welcome wisp of steam rose from the pot's spout. He set the items down near the lantern. "It's not much," he said, his voice low, "but it's hot." He poured the coffee, a stream of dark, fragrant liquid that filled the loft with its bitter, comforting aroma. He handed one mug to her. His fingers were calloused and ingrained with the dirt of his work, but his touch was careful as he passed her the hot cup. Ella wrapped her hands around the warm tin, the heat seeping into her chilled fingers. She sat down on the edge of the blanketed hay, her back against a sturdy post. Colt settled himself a few feet away, leaning against a different post, creating a comfortable distance between them. They were sharing the light, but not crowding each other's space. And then they drank. The coffee was strong, black, and unsweetened. It was bracing, a shock to the system that seemed to clear her head. They drank in a silence that was no longer empty or tense, but companionable. It was filled with the small sounds of the night, the gentle sigh of a sleeping horse in the stall below, the rustle of a mouse in the far corners of the loft, the mournful whisper of the high country wind as it curled around the eaves of the barn. They didn't look at each other. Ella watched the steam curl from her cup, a tiny, fleeting ghost in the lantern light. She listened to the steady, quiet sound of his breathing. For the first time since the train had pulled into Dusthorn, she felt her own shoulders begin to relax. The rigid posture she had maintained for hours, a suit of armor against the world's judgment, began to soften. Here, in the quiet dark, sitting with a stranger who asked nothing of her. She was not the tall woman from Kansas. She was not a failed mail-order bride or an object of pity and scorn. She was just a woman, tired and cold, drinking a cup of coffee. The simplicity of it was a profound relief. When the mugs were empty, Colt took them from her. The small ritual was over. "Get some rest, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle. He stood and climbed back down the ladder, taking the coffee pot and mugs with him. A moment later, his hand appeared again, placing the lantern on the floor of the loft. Its wick turned down low so it cast only a dim, reassuring glow. Then he was gone. Ella was alone. She listened until she heard the soft creak of the cot in the tack room below. He was there, a guardian in the dark. She took off her dusty boots and lay down on the blankets, pulling the second one over her. The hay was a soft, fragrant mattress beneath her, conforming to the shape of her body. The wool of the blanket was rough against her cheek. Through the hatch, she could see 1,000 sharp, indifferent stars. For the first time since she'd read Carter Linnell's letters, she felt no hope. But in its place was something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a small, quiet sense of peace. The man downstairs had offered her more than just a roof. He had offered her a moment to simply be, and it was a greater kindness than she had ever known. Ella woke to the gentle, rhythmic sounds of a world that did not wait for grief. A rooster crowed from somewhere behind the saloon, its call thin and defiant in the crisp morning air. Below her, a horse stamped its foot, a solid, earthy thud that vibrated up through the floorboards. Thin, bright blades of sunlight sliced through the gaps in the barn's plank walls, striping the hay-dusted air with gold. For a long moment, she lay perfectly still, wrapped in the rough wool of the horse blanket. The loft had been a refuge, a dark, quiet womb that had protected her from the town. But the sun was relentless. It was pouring over the walls, demanding that the day begin, demanding that she make a choice. She could stay here, hidden in the sweet-smelling hay, and wait. But wait for what? For Colt Brannon's charity to run out, for hunger to drive her out into the street. Defeated, or she could face it. The memory of Carter Linnell's face, a mask of shock and revulsion, was a fresh, sharp pain. The memory of the town's collective stare was a brand on her skin. The thought of walking back out into that street, of facing those eyes again, made her stomach clench with a cold, sickening dread. It would be so much easier to curl into a ball and disappear. But the women in her family, the West women, were not built for disappearing. They were built like the Kansas soil, plain and sturdy, meant to endure harsh seasons and yield what they could. Her height, the very thing that had brought this shame upon her, was a part of that heritage. Her grandmother had always told her, "Never slouch. Ella, the good Lord made you to look the world in the eye, not to stare at its feet." Drawing a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of hay and dust, Ella sat up. On the crate near her valise sat a tin canteen of water and a thick slice of dark bread wrapped in a cloth, a silent offering from the man downstairs. She drank the water, the cool liquid a balm to her dry throat, and ate the bread slowly, methodically. It was sustenance, not comfort, and sustenance was what she needed. She smoothed her dress as best she could, tucked the stray wisps of her hair back into a severe bun at the nape of her neck, and put on her boots. She would not scuttle out of the barn like a frightened mouse. She would walk. She took her reticule, which contained the few coins she had left, and, more importantly, her small sewing kit, a packet of needles, a thimble, and a spool of sturdy thread. It was the one inheritance of value she possessed. Then, she climbed down the ladder. The main aisle of the stable was empty. Colt Brannon was nowhere to be seen, though she could hear him in the corral out back, his voice a low, steady murmur as he spoke to a horse. He was giving her the space to do this on her own. She was grateful for it. She pushed open the heavy barn door and stepped out into the full force of the morning. Dusthorn was already bustling. Wagons rattled down the main street, and the air was filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation. And, immediately, the stares began. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store stopped, broom held motionless, her mouth a thin, hard line. Two men sharing a smoke outside the land office fell silent, their eyes following her. It was as if a play had been paused for her entrance onto the stage. Ella set her jaw and fixed her gaze on the sign of the general store at the far end of the street. She put one foot in front of the other. Her stride was long and even. She did not hurry. She did not look down. She could feel the whispers starting, a ripple of sound that followed in her wake. "There she is, the blacksmith's folly." "Lord have mercy, she's tall as a sunflower." A coarser voice from the saloon porch drawled. "Built like a damn Clydesdale. What would a man even do with all that?" The words were like pebbles thrown at her back, small and sharp. She imagined them bouncing off, unable to penetrate the rigid wall of her spine. Her grandmother's voice was in her ear. Asterisk, look the world in the eye. But she could not bring herself to meet their gazes. To look at them would be to acknowledge them, to let them see the tremor of fear and humiliation she was fighting to control. So she looked straight ahead, her face a stoic, unreadable mask. Inside the general store, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured meat, and boat cloth. The proprietor, a balding man with suspicious eyes, watched her every move as she purchased a small spool of black thread and a packet of needles. She paid with her precious coins, her hand steady as she counted them onto the counter. Her plan was simple, born of desperation. She could not afford to leave Dusthorn, and she would not accept charity for long. The only thing she had of value was the skill in her hands. She had noticed it yesterday. In the fleeting moments before her world had collapsed, the clothes of the townspeople were often patched and mended. In a place like this, things were made to last, and a good seamstress was always needed. Her first target was a woman she had seen on the edge of the crowd yesterday, a young widow named Sarah Reed, whose two small boys were a whirlwind of torn knees and ripped shirt sleeves. Ella found her behind a small, weathered cabin at the edge of town, trying to hang laundry while her sons engaged in a mock battle with wooden swords. Sarah was thin and harried, a perpetual frown etched between her brows. She looked up as Ella approached, her expression immediately becoming guarded, wary. She, too, had heard the stories. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her tone flat, discouraging conversation. Ella did not waste time with pleasantries. She held up her sewing kit. "I am a seamstress," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I do mending. Your boy has torn the knee of his trousers." Sarah's eyes flickered down to her son's pants, then back to Ella's face. "I do my own mending, thank you." It was a dismissal. "I'm sure you do," Ella replied, her tone even. "But your basket is full, your boys are quick, and the day is short. Let me mend that tear for you. No charge, a demonstration of my work. If you find it satisfactory, perhaps you have other items that need attention. If not, you have lost nothing." Sarah hesitated. She looked at the overflowing mending basket on her porch, then at the determined, plain face of the tall woman before her. Pride warred with exhaustion. Exhaustion won. With a sigh, she pulled her son over, who complained loudly. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not paying." "That is the arrangement," Ella agreed. She sat on the edge of the porch steps, took the boy's small trousers, and set to work. And here, she was transformed. Her hands, which looked so large and clumsy when idle, became instruments of incredible precision. The thimble was a small silver helmet on her finger, the needle a flashing rapier. Her stitches were not the large, serviceable stitches of a hurried mother. They were tiny, perfect, and even a line of black thread so straight and strong it looked as if it had been drawn by a draftsman's pen. In less than 5 minutes, the ragged, gaping tear was gone, replaced by a nearly invisible seam, reinforced from behind with a small, neat patch cut from a scrap she carried. The repaired knee was stronger than the original fabric. She handed the trousers back to Sarah. The younger woman took them, her fingers tracing the line of stitches. Her eyes widened in genuine astonishment. She looked from the perfect seam to Ella's capable hands, and then, for the first time, to her face. The suspicion in her eyes was replaced by a grudging respect. I've never seen such fine work," Sarah admitted, her voice soft. I charge very little, Ella said. Not for coin, if you don't have it. A loaf of bread, a few eggs, a bit of cheese. Whatever you can spare. Sarah looked again at her mending basket, a mountain of small, tedious tasks that represented hours she did not have. She made a decision. Wait here, she said. She returned a moment later with the basket. Can you fix all this? I can, Ella said. I can give you 2 loaves of bread and a small jar of apple butter, Sarah offered. That is a fair price, Ella said, and with that, she had her first customer. Word traveled in the way that it does among women in small, isolated towns. It was not the gossip of the main street, but a more practical, valuable currency of information exchanged over clotheslines and while drawing water from the town well. Sarah Reed told the wife of a rancher whose husband was always tearing his shirts on barbed wire. That woman, in turn, told her sister, who had 3 daughters who were constantly outgrowing or ripping their dresses. The women came to her cautiously at first, leaving their bundles of mended clothes by the livery door. They were drawn not by friendship, but by the undeniable quality of her craft. They were a class of people who understood the value of a well-made seam, of a blanket that would last another winter, of a dress that could be handed down. Ella's stitches spoke a language they understood and respected. She did her work sitting on a crate just inside the cool shade of the livery stable. She did not engage in gossip. She did not speak of her arrival, and they did not ask. Their conversations were of practical things: the cost of flour, the best way to soothe a teething baby, the signs of a coming storm. Gradually, the wariness in their eyes softened. They began to see not the freakish tall woman from the train platform, but the quiet, dignified person with the magical needle. They saw her hands, which could take something broken and make it whole and strong again. And in that, they saw a reflection of the woman herself. She had arrived broken and humiliated, but she had not shattered. She had, with her own 2 hands, begun to stitch a new life for herself, one perfect, unbreakable seam at a time. Weeks bled into a month, and the sharp edges of Ella's arrival in dust-torn began to soften, worn down by the rhythm of routine. Her life found a new, quiet shape, defined not by the walls of a home, but by the wide, shaded space just inside the livery doors. This became her domain. From sunup until the light failed, she sat on an overturned crate, her back against the solid, comforting wood of a stall, and worked. Her needle, a tiny silverfish, darted in and out of denim, calico, and wool, leaving a trail of perfect, unbreakable stitches. The livery itself became her sanctuary. The horses were her silent companions, their soft knickers and heavy, hay-scented sighs a constant, soothing presence. She learned the individual sounds of each animal, the impatient hoof-stamping of the bay gelding, the gentle whicker of the old mare. In turn, they grew accustomed to her, a tall, quiet figure who smelled of thread and soap, and whose movements were as calm and predictable as their own daily feedings. She and Colt Brannan maintained their delicate, unspoken arrangement. He never entered her loft again, and she never ventured into the small tack room where he slept. They were neighbors, sharing a roof, each respecting the other's territory. Her presence brought a certain order to his world, the scent of washed linen, the neat piles of mended clothes, and his presence provided a silent, formidable wall between her and the town's lingering curiosity. He was the stable's keeper, and she, by extension, had become part of what he kept. His visits began subtly, without announcement. They were not social calls. They were simply an extension of his work, a lingering in the space they now shared. The first time, he returned from the general store with a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. He set it down on the crate beside her mending basket without a word. When she looked up, he was already walking away toward the corral. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm from the baker's oven. It was not a payment. Her work for the baker's wife had already been compensated with flour. It was a gift, plain and simple. She ate it that evening, and it tasted like kindness. Other times, He would bring 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept brewing on the small stove in the tack room. He'd hand one to her and lean against the massive frame of the stable door, sipping his own while he watched the goings-on of the main street. He seemed to find a kind of peace in the simple act of standing guard, of being a barrier. And slowly they began to talk. Their conversations were not built of grand questions or deep confessions. They were pieced together from the small, discarded scraps of everyday life. They spoke the language of repair, of things that were broken and needed fixing. One afternoon, as he was expertly stitching a tear in a leather saddle skirt with a heavy awl and waxed thread, he nodded toward the child's boot she was resoling. "Hard land for leather," he commented, his voice a low rumble. "And for children," she'd replied, not looking up from her work. They seemed determined to run their shoes straight into the ground. He'd grunted in agreement, a sound of shared understanding. They both knew what it meant to fight against the constant, grinding wear of this place. Another day, under the high, unforgiving sun, he worked without a shirt, his back and shoulders slick with sweat as he shod a difficult stallion. A long, pale scar, shaped like a serpent, snaked across his left forearm. Ella's eyes had rested on it for a moment longer than she'd intended. He noticed her gaze but did not tense or try to hide it. He finished hammering the last nail, his movements economical and sure, wiping his brow with the back of his unmarred arm. He spoke without looking at her directly. "Barbed wire," he said, his voice matter-of-fact, "from when I was a boy. Fences have a way of leaving their mark if you're not careful." It wasn't a story seeking pity. It was a simple statement of fact. A life lived leaves scars. She looked down at her own hand, at a small, silvery crescent on her right thumb where a needle had once slipped, driving deep. "So do needles," she said quietly. He glanced over at her then, and a flicker of something recognition, perhaps passed between them. They were 2 marked people, branded by different tools of the trade, and they did not need to ask for the stories. The scars were stories enough. The first rains of March kept them both confined to the livery for a full afternoon. The world outside dissolved into a gray, drumming sheet of water. The sound of it on the stable's tin roof was a steady, rhythmic roar, isolating them completely. The air grew cool and smelled of wet earth and damp hay. Colt stood for a long time at the open door, watching the street turn to a river of mud. "Good for the ranchers," he said, "finally. The grass will be rich this spring." "Hard on my customers' hems," Ella noted, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "The mud will claim its share." He'd turned then, and she saw him smile, in return a rare, quiet thing that briefly softened the hard lines of his face. "Well then," he said, "sounds like good weather for business. For both of us." In these small moments, a fragile intimacy was woven, stitch by careful stitch. He never asked her why she'd come to Dusthorn, and she never asked him why he'd stayed. Their pasts were ghosts that stood silently behind them, acknowledged but never invited into the conversation. Their present was the solid, tangible world of worn leather, torn cloth, changing seasons, and the shared, quiet space of the stable. One evening in late September, as the days grew shorter and the air held the first crisp promise of autumn, the town began to buzz with a different kind of energy. It was the annual harvest dance, a celebration of the year's hard-won yields. From her seat in the livery, Ella could hear the sounds of preparation, the laughter of women, the rhythmic hammering as a platform was erected in the street, and, in the distance, the cheerful, discordant tuning of a fiddle. It was the sound of a community coming together, a community of which she was still not truly a part. She was a service provider, a fixture, but not a friend. The dance was not for her. Colt finished his work for the day, rubbing down the last horse until its coat shone like polished mahogany even in the dimming light. But instead of retiring to the tack room, he walked over to where she sat, putting the final stitches into a farmer's canvas coat. He stopped in front of her, his large frame blocking what was left of the light. He was empty-handed, No coffee, no bread. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It was the first time she had ever seen him look uncertain. She finished her stitch and bit the thread, looking up at him. Mr. Brannan. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her head. Miss West, he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. You've likely heard the noise. They're holding the harvest dance on Saturday night. I had heard, she said, her tone neutral. He took a breath. I was wondering, he said, his eyes finally dropping to meet hers. They were serious and a little bit nervous. If a fellow was to, well, if I was to ask if you'd consider attending it with me, would you turn me down flat? The question caught her completely off guard. It was a possibility so foreign to her experience that she had never, not even for a moment, contemplated it. Her, Ella Marin West, at a dance. The image was absurd. She could already feel the stares, hear the whispers. She could picture herself, a giantess stumbling through a reel, a clumsy spectacle for the whole town to enjoy. The old shame, which had become a dull, manageable ache, threatened to flare up, sharp and hot. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. It was a kind rejection, meant to protect them both. Mr. Brannan. That's a charitable thought, but I'm not much of a dancer. She expected him to nod, to accept the excuse and retreat. It was, after all, the truth. But he didn't move. A slow smile, that rare, quiet thing, spread across his face. He met her gaze, and there was no pity in it, only a shared, honest truth. Well, that makes two of us, ma'am, he said, his voice losing its nervous edge and settling back into its familiar, steady rumble. I've been told I move with all the grace of a three-legged mule. He wasn't trying to charm her. He wasn't flattering her. He was simply meeting her where she stood, on the common solid ground of their own imperfections. He was not asking her to be graceful or beautiful or refined. He was just asking her to be clumsy with him. The breath she'd been holding escaped in a small, surprised huff. She looked at him, at his steady gray eyes and the quiet smile that did not mock her. And, for the first time, she considered that a dance might not be a performance, but simply a shared experience between two people who were not perfect and did not pretend to be. The idea was as terrifying and as strangely hopeful as anything she had ever known. The 2 days leading up to the harvest dance were a quiet war waged inside Ella's own mind. Every time she looked at the bundle of midnight blue calico she had purchased from the general store, a cold wave of fear washed over her. It was one thing to agree to go to a dance in the relative privacy of the stable. It was another thing entirely to walk into the heart of the town's festivities, a willing target for every eye. The whispers would be a storm. The stares would be daggers. She thought of a dozen excuses, a sudden headache, a pressing mending order that couldn't wait. She could simply tell Colt she had changed her mind, that she wasn't brave enough. He would understand. He would not press her. He would simply nod, his gray eyes revealing nothing, and the quiet, fragile thing growing between them would wither. The thought of that was, somehow, worse than the thought of the town's scorn. So, on the afternoon of the dance, she cleared a space in the hayloft, unrolled the fabric, and set to work. This was the one battlefield where she was the undisputed master. Her shears cut through the dark blue cloth with a crisp, satisfying whisper. Her needle, guided by a thimble-worn finger, flew with a speed and precision that was second nature. She was not making a gown for a ball. She was forging armor. The design was her own, born of necessity and a deep, intrinsic understanding of form and function. There were no ruffles, no delicate lace, no fripperies designed to make a woman look like a fragile flower. The dress was simple, almost severe in its lines. It had a modest, high neckline, long, fitted sleeves, and a bodice tailored with such expert darting that it fit her broad shoulders and strong back perfectly, without pulling or bunching. The skirt was full enough for movement, but not ostentatious, cut to fall in a clean, straight line to the tops of her sturdy boots. The fabric itself, the color of a Wyoming sky just after the sun has set, was the only ornament in another woman's hands. It might have been a plain, funereal garment, but under Ella's needle, it became a statement, the perfection of the seams, the flawless drape of the fabric, the way it dignified her stature rather than trying to diminish it. It was a testament to her skill and her refusal to apologize for the space she occupied in the world. As she sewed the final stitch, she knew it was the finest thing she had ever made. When dusk settled, painting the sky in the very colors of her dress, she washed her face and hands in a basin of cool water and put it on. It felt strange and wonderful to wear something made for herself, something that fit not just her body, but her spirit. Colt was waiting for her at the bottom of the ladder. He had been working in the corral, and she had heard him come in, heard the splash of water as he washed at the pump. He had changed into a clean, faded blue shirt and dark trousers. His hair was damp and combed back from his face, and he was clean-shaven, the line of his jaw sharp and defined in the lantern light. He looked different, younger, and achingly real. He watched her descend the ladder, his face unreadable. He did not smile. He did not offer a clumsy compliment. He simply watched her, his eyes taking in the dark blue dress, the neat coil of her hair, the straightness of her back. His gaze was not an inventory of her flaws or an assessment of her strangeness. It was a look of quiet, profound acknowledgement. He looked at her as if he were seeing the person he already knew, but illuminated for the first time. When she reached the bottom, he gave a single, slow nod. "Miss West," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was all he needed to say. He offered her his arm. The gesture was formal, correct, yet deeply startling. No man had ever offered her his arm before. She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand on his forearm. Through the fabric of his sleeve, his arm was as hard and unyielding as an oak branch. It felt like an anchor. Together, they walked out of the sanctuary of the stable and into the town. The dance was being held in the wide, cleared space between the general store and the land office. A wooden platform had been raised for the musicians, a fiddler and a man with a banjo, and the area was strung with dozens of lanterns, their flickering yellow light casting a warm, festive glow and making the shadows dance. The air was alive with the bright, energetic music and the rhythmic stomp of boots on sawdust-strewn earth. Laughter pealed through the crisp autumn air. Their arrival was not a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping realization that moved through the crowd like a change in the weather. A man near the edge of the clearing saw them first, his laughter catching in his throat. He nudged his neighbor, who turned and fell silent. The silence spread, a contagion of shock, passing from one knot of people to the next. The dancing faltered, couples stumbling to a halt. The laughter died. The banjo player's fingers fumbled on the strings, producing a discordant twang before he, too, stopped. Finally, the fiddler, sawing away with his eyes closed, noticed the profound quiet. His bow scraped across the strings one last time, a mournful, dying note that hung in the air like a question. And then there was nothing but the soft hiss of the lanterns and the sound of Ella's own blood roaring in her ears. Every single person, man, woman, and child, was staring. Ella could see Carter Lionel standing near the cider barrel, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief and fury. She saw Sarah Reed, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with astonishment. It was the train platform all over again. But this time it was 100 times worse. This time, she had walked willingly into the lion's den. Her hand tightened on Colt's arm, her knuckles white. She felt a tremor run through her, a desperate, primal urge to turn and flee back to the shadows of the barn. But Colt did not stop. His pace remained slow, deliberate, and calm. He seemed utterly oblivious to the suffocating silence, to the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. He led her away from the edge of the crowd, walking directly into the empty circle in the center of the clearing, the space where the dancing was supposed to be. He stopped in the very middle of it all, under the brightest of the lanterns, and turned to face her. He released her arm and took a small step back, and he looked up at her. He had to tilt his head back slightly to meet her eyes, a simple, physical fact that, in that moment, became the most profound gesture she had ever witnessed. Carter Lionel had refused to look up. The other men in her life had stared at her chest or her shoulders, their gazes unwilling to make the full journey to her face. But Colt Brannon looked up, his gaze clear and direct, his expression calm. He was not ashamed to be seen with her. He was not intimidated by her. In his eyes, she saw not her reflection as a freak or a giantess, but as a woman, just a woman. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, standing in a circle of light, surrounded by a silent, watching town. "They're waiting for the music," he said, his voice low and for her ears alone. He raised his hand and placed it gently, formally, on the small of her back. The warmth of it seeped through the fabric of her dress, a solid, reassuring pressure. He lifted his other hand, inviting hers, hesitantly. She placed her left hand on his broad shoulder, and her right hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, his calloused palm enveloping her hand completely. It was a perfect fit. He gave a slight nod to the fiddler on the stage. The man, looking utterly bewildered, seemed to startle back to life. After a moment of hesitation, he raised his bow and began to play. It was not the fast, stomping reel from before. It was a waltz, slow and simple and hauntingly sweet. And then they danced. They were not graceful. Colt had been right. He was not a natural dancer. And Ella, hyper-aware of her size and long limbs, was stiff with fear. Their first few steps were clumsy, a hesitant shuffle, but Colt held her firmly. He did not try to lead her in any complex patterns. He simply began to turn, slowly, in a small, tight circle. He kept his eyes on hers, a calm gray anchor in a sea of staring faces. Slowly. Ella began to breathe again. She focused on the feel of his hand on her back, the steady strength in his shoulder beneath her palm. She focused on his eyes, and the world beyond them began to blur. The faces of the townspeople, their mouths agape, their eyes wide with judgment, receded into the flickering darkness at the edge of the light. The rhythm of the waltz was the steady beat of a heart. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was the rhythm of his breathing, of her own. They turned, a two-person universe in the center of a silent town. She was taller than him. Her chin was level with his forehead. For the first time in her life, she danced with a man and did not have to hunch her shoulders or bend her neck. She could stand straight, her spine aligned, and look directly into her partner's face. No one spoke. No one whispered. The entire town of Dusthorn stood motionless, watching the stable hand and the giantess from Kansas turn slowly in the lantern light. They were watching a spectacle, but it was not the one they had expected. It was not a comedy. It was something quieter and stranger and far more powerful. And as the last sweet note of the waltz faded into the cold night air, they all knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that something in their town had just irrevocably changed. The sweet, lingering note of the waltz faded, but its echo remained. In the days that followed the harvest dance, the town of Dusthorn was a different place for Ella. The silence that had met her arrival had been a wall of judgment. The silence that had greeted her dance with Colt had been a crucible of shock. Now, both had been replaced by a low, incessant murmur, the rustle of 1,000 whispers that followed her wherever she went. The town had seen them. They had seen the tall, quiet man from the livery stable stand in the center of their world and claim the woman their most respectable blacksmith had discarded. They had seen him look up at her not with shame, but with an unmistakable, possessive calm, and the town, having witnessed the unthinkable, now had to make sense of it. The narrative began to twist, its chief author a man whose pride had been publicly wounded, Carter Linnell, who had once held the power to define Ella with a single, dismissive word, now sought to redefine her again. He could not abide the image of her standing tall and dignified in a dress of her own making, her hand in that of a man like Colt Brannan. It made his own judgment look cheap and foolish, and so he began to speak. He did not shout it from the rooftops. His poison was more subtle, administered in the masculine confines of the saloon and the smithy, where the word of a business owner held weight. He'd lean against the bar, nursing a whiskey, his voice a low, confidential rumble of feigned concern. "It's a pity, is what it is," he'd say to a listening rancher, shaking his head slowly. "A woman arrives here, alone and vulnerable, and falls in with the first man who'll have her, especially a man like Brannan." He'd let the name hang in the air. When his listener looked intrigued, he'd continue, choosing his words like carefully weighted tools. "She's got him convinced. It seems a woman who's willing to live in a barn. Well, it suggests a certain lack of moral fiber, doesn't it? It's not respectable. She's leading him on, playing on his sympathies." The seed was planted. Ella was not a victim, but a predator, a woman of loose morals, using her wiles on a simple, stable hand, but the true venom was reserved for Colt. "And Brannan," Carter would say, lowering his voice even further. "He's a quiet one, keeps to himself. But there's a reason for that. Folks have short memories, but I don't. I remember when he first drifted into this town. A man doesn't get that look in his eye, that hardness, from an honest life's work. You ask yourself, is that really the kind of man a decent woman would choose to live with? Alone, a man who's done time." The word, once spoken, took on a life of its own *time*. It was a stain, a brand. The rumor spread from the men at the saloon to their wives at the church social, the women who had begun to see Ella as a skilled artisan, a quiet, dignified presence, now saw her through a new, dirtier lens. Was her skill just a facade? Was her reserve a sign of shame? Ella felt the shift immediately. The air grew colder around her. A woman who had been friendly the week before now crossed the street to avoid her, her face a mask of pinched disapproval. Mending baskets that had once appeared regularly at the livery door became scarce. Even Sarah Reed, who still brought her son's torn trousers, did so with a new nervousness, her eyes darting around as if she were engaged in a clandestine transaction. She no longer lingered to chat about the weather. Through it all, Ella remained silent. It was the only defense she had ever known. She had weathered the storm of public humiliation by standing tall and refusing to bend. She would weather this one the same way. To deny the rumors would be to give them credence, to show that their barbs had found their mark. So she continued her work, her head held high, her back ramrod straight. She sat on her crate just inside the stable door, her needle moving with the same unwavering precision, even as her heart felt as if it were being stitched together with coarse, jagged thread. She did not ask Colt if the rumors were true. The kindness he had shown her, the quiet respect in his eyes as they danced, had forged a loyalty in her that a rumor could not break. But the word hovered in the space between them. Unspoken, an ugly convict. She found herself watching him as he worked, looking for a sign of it, for the shadow of a hidden past. But all she saw was the same steady, capable man who had offered her shelter when the rest of the world had offered only scorn. Her silence was a shield. But Colt Brannan was not a man to hide behind one. He heard the talk, of course. A man who worked with horses learned to listen, to sense a change in the wind. He heard it in the way men fell quiet when he entered the general store. He felt it in the wary glances from the same people who had, just a week ago, been nodding a polite hello. The final proof came from the mouth of a drunken ranch hand who, stumbling out of the saloon, saw Colt and sneered. "Looky here, the jailbird and his giantess, quite a pair." Colt did not react. He simply watched the man stagger away, his expression unchanging, his jaw tight, but a cold, quiet decision settled in him. He knew the source of this poison. He had ignored Carter Linnell's petty animosity for years, but Lionel had made the mistake of dragging Ella into it, and that was a line he would not allow to be crossed. The next afternoon, Colt walked out of the livery stable and down the main street, his stride unhurried and purposeful. He did not stop at the saloon or the general store. He walked directly to the source, to the smithy at the end of the road, where the rhythmic, angry clang of a hammer on steel rang out like a challenge. He stepped into the smithy's wide, open doorway, a tall silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. The interior was a cavern of heat and shadow, smelling of coal smoke, sweat, and hot iron. Carter Linnell, his face red from the heat of the forge and his own simmering anger, was hammering a glowing orange horseshoe into shape on his anvil. He did not look up, though he knew Colt was there. The rhythm of his hammering became faster, harder, each strike a release of frustration. Colt waited patiently, his arms crossed over his chest. He stood just inside the doorway, letting the heat wash over him, his calm a stark contrast to the violent energy of the forge. Finally, Carter slammed the hammer down one last time, the clang echoing through the building, and plunged the horseshoe into a barrel of water. It hissed and screamed, a furious cloud of steam erupting into the air. Carter turned, wiping his sweaty brow with a soot-stained forearm. His face was arrogant, defiant. "What do you want?" "Brannon," he demanded, his voice raspy. "I'm busy. I run a business here. The implication was clear asterisk unlike you asterisk." "Lionel," Colt said, his voice quiet but carrying easily over the hiss of the cooling iron. "You've been talking—" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Carter scoffed, picking up a pair of tongs. "It's a free country. I'll talk about what I please. Town's got a right to know what kind of people are living in it." Colt took 2 slow steps into the smithy, moving out of the doorway and into the flickering firelight. He was not smiling. His gray eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "You can say what you want about me," Colt said, his voice dangerously soft. "You've been doing it one way or another since I got here. I don't care what lies you tell about my past." He paused, letting the words sink in. He took another step, his shadow falling over the anvil. "But you will stop talking about Miss West," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Effective immediately. Her name is not for you to speak. It doesn't belong in your mouth." The air in the smithy grew thick and heavy, charged with a tension that was hotter than the forge itself. Carter was a strong man, his arms corded with the muscles of his trade, but Colt possessed a different kind of strength, a still, coiled intensity that promised a capacity for violence that Carter's bluster could not match. Carter's bravado began to falter. He tightened his grip on the tongs, his knuckles white. "Is that a threat?" Colt didn't answer directly. He simply looked at Carter, his gaze unwavering, and in that look was all the answer the blacksmith needed. It was a look that promised consequences, swift and certain. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had drawn a line in the sand. For a long, silent moment, the 2 men stood locked in a battle of wills. The only sounds were the crackle of the forge and the drip of water from the cooling barrel. Finally, Carter's gaze wavered. He looked away, down at the anvil, at the tools of his trade that suddenly seemed inadequate. "She's not your concern," Carter muttered, his voice sullen, defeated. "You're wrong," Colt said softly. "She is," without another word. Colt turned and walked out of the smithy, leaving Carter Linnell standing alone in the suffocating heat of his own making. The hammering did not resume for a very long time. Colt had not silenced the whole town, but he had silenced the source. The whispers would continue, but the poison would no longer be actively spread. He had defended Ella, but in doing so, he had confirmed a part of the rumor, and he knew, as he walked back toward the livery stable, that he now owed her the one thing they had never shared: the truth. When Colt returned, the sun was low in the sky, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stable's dusty floor. Ella was where he had left her, sitting on her crate, but her hands were still. A half-mended shirt lay forgotten in her lap. She had seen him walk toward the smithy. She had seen him return. She did not know what had passed between him and Carter Lionel, but she saw a new and somber gravity in the set of his shoulders. He didn't speak at first. He moved through the familiar evening chores with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. He checked the water troughs, forked fresh hay into the mangers, and spoke in a low, soothing voice to the horses. Ella watched him, her needle resting between her fingers. The air in the stable, usually so comfortable and quiet, was now thick with the weight of things unsaid. The rumors he had gone to confront were now a palpable presence between them. Finally, the work was done. The horses were settled for the night, their soft munching the only sound. Colt wiped his hands on a rag, his back to her. He stood like that for a long moment, staring at a row of harnesses hanging on the wall, their brass buckles gleaming dully in the fading light. "He won't be spreading any more stories," Colt said, his voice quiet, directed at the wall. Ella's hands tightened on the shirt in her lap. What stories, she asked. Though she knew, she wanted to hear it from him. He turned around slowly. His face was tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the day's events. He walked over and leaned against the stall opposite her, not too close, but near enough that they didn't have to raise their voices. "The ones Lionel has been telling," he said, "about you, about me." He finally met her gaze, his own clear and steady, "about me having done time." Ella held her breath. Here it was, the truth or the denial. "It's true," he said simply. There was no shame in his voice, no defiance. It was a fact, like the color of his eyes or the scar on his arm. "I was in a jail for 6 months, back in Nebraska." He let the fact settle in the space between them. He was giving her a chance to react, to pull away, to show the disgust or fear he must have been so used to seeing. But Ella remained still, her expression unwavering. She had accepted his kindness on faith. She would accept his past the same way. She simply waited for the rest. Seeing that she was not going to turn from him, he continued, his voice dropping into a low, narrative monotone, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else a long time ago. "I had a younger sister," he began, "Lydia. She was a bright thing, full of music. She was 17. He paused, and for a fleeting second, a shadow of profound pain crossed his face before he mastered it. "There was a man in our town, the station master, a man of some importance. He had a wife and children, and a position on the church council. He took a shine to Lydia, not a healthy shine. He'd find reasons to talk to her, to bring packages to the house. Small things at first, but his eyes, they weren't right." Ella pictured it instantly, the small town, the powerful man, the pretty girl. It was an old and ugly story. "Lydia was scared of him," Colt went on. "She told me he'd tried to corner her behind the freight house, told her things a man like that has no business saying to a girl. We told our father, but he was a cautious man. He didn't want to make trouble with an important man like Mr. Abernathy. He just told Lydia to be careful, to stay away from the station." Colt looked down at his own hands, large and calloused, as if seeing them for the first time. "One evening, I was coming home late. I heard a noise from the alley behind the mercantile. A cry. It was Lydia. Abernathy had her pinned against the wall. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. He wasn't being gentle. She was fighting him. But she was just a girl." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the picture he painted even more vivid. more horrifying. I don't remember thinking, he said. I just saw it, and I reacted. I pulled him off her. He turned on me, his face all twisted and ugly with drink and surprise. He was bigger than me then. He threw a punch. We fought. It wasn't a clean fight. It was all dust and grunting and blind rage. I hit him until he stopped moving. I hit him harder than I should have. He fell silent. The stable was so quiet that Ella could hear a horse's tail swish in the stall behind him. Lydia was hysterical. I took her home. The next morning, the sheriff came. Abernathy had a broken jaw and 2 cracked ribs. He told everyone I'd ambushed him in the alley, tried to rob him. A drunken brawl. He called it. It was his word against mine, his word against Lydia's. But Lydia's testimony, they didn't want to hear it. To them, it was the panicked story of a girl trying to protect her older brother. To admit she was telling the truth would be to admit that the church-going station master was a predator. It was easier to believe I was a young hothead with a temper. The injustice of it was a bitter pill, and Ella felt the taste of it in her own throat. She knew what it was like to have your truth ignored, to be judged and defined by a story someone else had chosen to tell about you. They made an example of me, Colt said, his voice weary with the memory. 6 months. It wasn't so much the jail time that was the punishment. It was what came after. When I got out, I was marked. I was the boy who'd attacked the station master, the jailbird. Men I'd known my whole life wouldn't look me in the eye. I couldn't find work. My presence in that town was a constant shame to my family. So I left. I drifted for a couple of years, taking work where I could find it, and ended up here. Dusthorn is a good place to be forgotten. He finally looked up from his hands, and his gaze was raw, vulnerable. He was not asking for her pity. He was offering her an explanation. He was showing her the damaged goods, laying all the pieces out in the open for her inspection. I'm not a hero. Ella, he said, his voice soft but intense. I didn't save her. Not really. All I did was get myself sent to jail and bring shame on my family. Abernathy kept his job. My family eventually moved away. I just broke things. That's what I did. He took a small, hesitant step toward her, as if closing the final distance between his past and their present. What Lionel said, the part about me being trouble, it's not entirely a lie. I have a past. I'm not clean. Ella, he said, the words costing him dearly. Not like a man like him is, but I swear to you on whatever soul I have left, I will never, ever treat you like a burden. His promise hung in the quiet air between them, a direct and powerful counterpoint to the rejection that had brought her to this town. Carter Lionel had seen her as a burden to his reputation. The world had seen her as a burden to the eye. Colt, a man who carried the heavy burden of his own past, was promising to never lay such a weight on her. He saw her not as something to be carried, but as someone to stand beside. The shirt slid from Ella's lap and fell unnoticed to the floor. The story was over. The truth was out. And in the face of it, she felt not fear or disgust, but a wave of profound and overwhelming empathy. He was not a jailbird. He was a brother. He was a man who had traded his own future for a single moment of fierce, protective love. He saw himself as broken, but she saw him as the strongest man she had ever known. Slowly, she rose from her crate. She stood before him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He watched her, his expression uncertain, braced for her final judgment. She did not speak. Words were inadequate for what she felt. Instead, she lifted her hand, the one with the needle-scarred thumb, the one that knew the language of mending broken things, and gently, deliberately, she laid it on his forearm, right next to the pale, serpentine scar left by the barbed wire. Her touch was light, but it was electric. It was the first time she had ever willingly initiated contact with him, with any man. It was not a gesture of pity or of passion. It was a gesture of acceptance, of solidarity. It said, without a single word. Asterisk, I see your scars. They do not frighten me. I have scars of my own. Colt flinched, not from her touch, but from the unexpected shock of it. He looked down at her large, capable hand resting on his arm, and for the first time since he had started his story, the hard, protective mask on his face finally crumbled, and she saw in his eyes a flicker of the lonely, lost boy he must have been all those years ago. The seasons turned, and the raw, wind-swept plains of Wyoming submitted to the iron grip of winter. The world shrank. The vibrant colors of autumn bleached to shades of white and gray, and the wind, which had once whispered through the tall grass, now howled with a lonely, predatory voice. The town of Dusthorn drew into itself, its lifeblood retreating from the frozen streets to the warm, glowing interiors of its homes and the saloon. For Ella and Colt, their world shrank to the dimensions of the livery stable. The great, drafty barn became a fortress against the cold, its walls a barrier against the biting wind. Colt had moved the small wood stove from the tack room into a cleared, stone-flagged space in the center of the main aisle. It became the heart of their existence, a crackling, radiant sun around which their quiet lives now orbited. The loft was too cold for sleeping, so Ella had taken over the small, clean tack room, while Colt made a new bed for himself in a horse stall he'd lined with fresh, deep straw and thick blankets. They were separate, yet together, their days and nights measured by the shared tasks of survival, splitting wood, melting snow for the horses, ensuring the fire never died. The intimacy that had been forged in a moment of shared truth and a clumsy waltz now deepened in the enforced closeness of winter. The long silences between them were no longer spaces to be cautiously navigated. They were a shared language, as comfortable and familiar as the worn leather of the saddles that hung in the dim light. They spoke, of course, about small, practical things, but their real conversations happened in the quiet moments, the way he would add a log to the fire just as she began to shiver, the way she would leave a hot cup of coffee for him after he came in from a brutal struggle with a frozen water pump. One night, the first great blizzard of the season descended. The snow came not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, driving curtain of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked around the eaves of the barn, and the building groaned under the weight of the storm. But inside, their small circle of firelight held firm. The horses were calm in their stalls, their presence a warm, living comfort. Colt sat on a low stool, patiently mending a broken bridle, his head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the silver in his dark hair. Ella was nearby on her crate, her mending basket for once empty. Her hands, restless without a task, were clasped tightly in her lap. She watched the fire, its flames dancing and weaving, a wild, beautiful, and untamable thing. For weeks, a question had been forming in her heart. It was a terrifying and audacious thing, a question born of the safety she had found in this man's presence and the deep, aching loneliness she had carried her entire life. He had shared the ugliest part of his past with her, and she had met it not with judgment, but with a simple touch. He had stood with her before the entire town, offering his own solitude as a shield for hers. He had given her a place to be, a place to heal, a place to stand tall without apology. And she found that her gratitude had, over the long, quiet months, transformed into something deeper, something that felt as elemental and as powerful as the winter storm raging outside. She looked at him, at his strong, scarred hands working the leather, at the quiet competence in his every movement. He was a man marked by the world, an outcast just as she was. He had told her he had nothing left to lose. In that, they were the same. She, too, had lost everything she was supposed to be: a wife, a respectable woman, a part of a community. All they had left were the broken pieces of themselves and this small, warm circle of light they had created together. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. Her hands, clasped in her lap, were trembling. She drew a shaky breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was swallowed by a sudden, violent gust of wind that rattled the heavy stable doors. He looked up, his hand stilling on the leather. "Ma'am." She tried again, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "Colt," she said, a little louder this time, her voice unsteady. "I have a question to ask you." He set the bridle down carefully, giving her his full, undivided attention. His gray eyes were serious in the firelight, patient. He waited. "After all this time," she began, her gaze dropping to her own trembling hands. "After all you've done for me, after everything, I was wondering," she faltered, the courage that had seemed so strong a moment ago deserting her. "You can ask me anything, Ella," he said softly, using her given name for the first time in a quiet, intimate moment. The sound of it on his lips gave her the strength to continue. She looked up and met his gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Would you have regrets?" she asked, her voice cracking with the sheer, terrifying vulnerability of the question. If I were to stay here, not just through the winter, but truly stay." She paused, taking another ragged breath, forcing herself to say the last, most crucial part. "Would you regret it if the first night of my life was to be with a man who has nothing left to lose?" The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them, as stark and fragile as ice crystals. She had offered him the one thing of value she believed she still possessed, the untouched core of herself. It was not a coy proposition. It was a desperate, hopeful plea for a connection that went deeper than shared coffee and companionable silence. She was asking if he would be willing to take the broken pieces of her life and join them with his. Colt did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and the silence stretched on, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind. His expression was one she had never seen before. It was not surprise, not shock, not even desire. It was a look of profound, heart-stopping stillness, as if he were seeing not just the woman before him, but the entire, lonely journey that had brought her to this moment, to this question. He was looking at the immense courage it had taken for her to ask, and the terrible wound that lay just beneath the words. Just when the silence had become so heavy she thought it might shatter her, he slowly, deliberately, set his mending aside. He rose from his stool and came to her, kneeling on one knee before her crate so that, for the first time, their eyes were on a level. He did not speak. He did not need to. The answer was in his face, in the softening of the hard lines around his mouth, in the deep, aching tenderness that filled his eyes. He raised his hand, not to her face or her hair, but slowly, reverently, he reached for her. He did not pull her or grab her. He simply slid his arm around her back and gently, inexorably, drew her closer. He drew her off the crate and into his embrace, until she was kneeling with him on the cold stone floor before the fire. He pulled her against his chest, a low sound rumbling deep within him, a sound of sorrow and solace all at once. His other hand came up, not to caress, but to simply rest on the small of her back. The touch was light, yet it was the steadiest, most solid thing she had ever felt. It was a touch that did not ask for anything, but offered everything: safety, strength, a place to finally rest. It was a touch as firm and as grounding and as deeply rooted as the root of a great pine tree. She buried her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, which smelled of smoke and leather and him, and a single, shuddering sob of relief escaped her. It was the sound of a lifetime of loneliness finally breaking. He held her, absorbing the tremor, his hand on her back unmoving, a silent, unshakable promise in the heart of the storm. The question had been asked, and in the profound, wordless quiet of his embrace, it had been answered. The blizzard broke at dawn. The wind, exhausted from its night-long rampage, sighed into a profound and breathless silence. The world outside the livery stable had been remade, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. Sunlight, when it came, was not the harsh, direct light of the plains, but a soft, blue-white glare, reflected and refracted by a billion ice crystals, so brilliant it hurt the eyes. Inside the stable, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire in the stove and the gentle munching of a horse. Colt was already awake, sitting on his stool, staring into the flames. He had added wood while she slept, keeping the heart of their small world alive through the storm. Ella sat up in the tack room, the rough wool blanket pooled around her. The memory of the night before was not a dream. It was a quiet, solid presence inside her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She rose and dressed in the dim light. When she stepped out into the main aisle, Colt looked up. His face was calm, his gray eyes clear. There was no awkwardness in his gaze, no triumph, no regret. He looked at her as if she were the most natural sight in the world, a part of the morning, like the fire and the snow. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and she returned it. No words were spoken, none were needed. To speak of what had passed between them would be to try and capture a wild thing, to pin it down and examine it. It would have diminished it. What had happened in the heart of the storm was a silent language of its own, a communion of two lonely souls who had found in each other a refuge. It was a truth that now existed in the very air between them, as solid and real as the roof over their heads. She made the coffee, and he brought in buckets of snow to melt for the horses. They moved around each other in the familiar choreography of their shared life. But the space between them had changed. It was no longer a respectful distance, but a field of quiet energy, a connection that hummed just beneath the surface of the silence. The town was buried for 3 days, when the roads were finally cleared and life began to stir again. Ella took her mending basket and her crate and resumed her place just inside the stable's great open doors. She sat in the brilliant, reflected sunlight, the air so cold it felt like a clean, sharp blade against her cheek, and she began to sew. Her needle rose and fell, a flash of silver against the dark wool of a rancher's coat. Her stitches were, as always, perfect, tiny, even and strong, unbreakable. But something was different. Before, her work had been a kind of defiance, a way of proving her worth to a world that had judged her worthless. Her straight back had been a brace against expected insults. Now, there was no defiance in her posture. There was only peace. The straightness of her spine was not a defense. It was simply the way she was made. She was not waiting for the town's verdict anymore. She was not listening for the whispers. Her world had contracted to the solid warmth of the stable behind her, to the quiet presence of the man working in the corral, to the simple, satisfying rhythm of her own craft. She had found her center, and it was a place no opinion could touch. Sarah Reed was her first customer after the storm. She trudged through the snow, her son's torn trousers in her hand. She stopped before Ella and looked at her, and the look was different. The last vestiges of nervousness were gone, replaced by a simple, straightforward respect. She looked at Ella not as a strange phenomenon, but as a feature of the town, as permanent and necessary as the blacksmith's forge. "The snow is deep," Sarah said, stating a simple fact. "It is," Ella replied, her voice calm, "but the sun is strong. It will not last." They spoke of the weather, of the price of firewood, of the resilience of children. It was an ordinary conversation, but for Ella, it was a miracle. It was the first time a woman in this town had spoken to her as an equal, as just another woman enduring the hardships of a Wyoming winter. Later that day, she needed a spool of thread. She walked the length of the main street to the general store, her boots crunching in the packed snow. The air was full of the sound of men shoveling, their grunts and the scrape of steel on ice echoing in the cold. As she walked, she was aware of the eyes upon her, as always, but she no longer felt their sting. They were simply a fact of her life, like the color of the sky or the feel of the wind. A rancher, a hard-faced man named Peterson, whom she recognized from the harvest dance, was coming the other way on the narrow boardwalk. There was not quite enough room for them to pass. In the past, he would have expected her to step down into the deep snow to let him by. She braced for it, not with anger, but with a weary resignation. But he did not stop. He looked at her tall, calm figure, at the settled peace in her face. He saw the woman who had not been broken by public shame, the woman who had weathered rumor and exclusion, the woman who had found a home with the town's other outcast. He saw not a curiosity, but a survivor, and something in him, some old, ingrained plainsman's respect for sheer, stubborn endurance, shifted. As they drew level, he stopped, tipped his head, and gave her a short, gruff nod. Ella's heart did not leap. Her breath did not catch. A small, quiet sense of acknowledgement settled over her, as gentle as a snowflake. She looked him directly in the eye and returned the nod, a slight, graceful inclination of her head. Then, he took the step down into the snow, holding the wall to let her pass. She continued on to the store. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Colt continued his work. He moved with the seasons, his labor a constant, steady rhythm that was the heartbeat of the stable. He brought wood for the fire, his arms piled high. He gentled the horses, his voice a low murmur that was for them alone. He was the keeper of their sanctuary, the guardian of their quiet. He and Ella did not speak of love. The word was too small, too tame for what existed between them. What they had was a thing forged in silence and shame, tempered by kindness, and sealed in the heart of a winter storm. It was a loyalty as fierce and unspoken as the landscape around them. The nods became more frequent. They were never effusive, never accompanied by a smile. They were gestures of acknowledgement, of a grudging but undeniable respect. They were the town's slow, silent admission that Ella Marin West was not leaving. She was here. She was a part of this place now, woven into its fabric with her own strong, unbreakable thread. They nodded because she had earned her place not by fitting in, but by standing tall. They nodded not because they had finally accepted her, but because it had become profoundly clear to everyone, in the quiet, dignified set of her shoulders and the calm peace in her eyes, that she no longer needed them to. One evening, as the purple shadows of twilight began to stretch across the snow, Ella sat by the fire, her needle finally still. Colt came in from the corral, shaking the cold from his coat. He stopped and leaned against the doorframe, watching her. The firelight played on her face, softening its strong lines, illuminating the quiet contentment she now wore as easily as her own skin. She felt his gaze and looked up. The world outside, the town, the whispers, the past had all faded away. There was only the warm, crackling fire, the shelter of the stable, and the man standing in the doorway. A slow, genuine smile, a thing of pure and simple beauty, lit up her face. And Colt, seeing it, smiled back. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support. Thank you.